The child had been sitting on the same corner of the busy market street for as long as anyone could remember. People passed by, carrying bags, talking loudly on their phones, rushing from one place to another. Life around him moved fast, but his own little world stayed slow and quiet. He was small, thin, and often wrapped in clothes that were too big for him, donated by strangers who felt a moment of kindness. He never begged loudly. He didn't chase after anyone. He simply sat there with a hopeful look in his eyes, waiting to collect whatever coins people dropped in his tiny tin cup. What made the boy different from others wasn't the hardship he faced. Many street children faced the same struggles. What made him different was something hidden inside him, something no one could see just by looking at him. He carried a love for music that had grown inside him like a secret flame. Even though he didn't own a single musical instrument, not even a broken one, music lived in his heart, every day. When the afternoon sun softened and the shadows grew longer, he would walk toward a particular street in the market, not to collect coins, but to feed his imagination. There was a small music store there, squeezed between a bakery and a clothing shop. The store wasn't fancy, but it had one thing that pulled him like a magnet: pianos. The large glass window of the shop was usually smudged with fingerprints from curious children. The boy would stand there quietly, pressing his palm to the glass, watching customers try the instruments inside. Sometimes grown-ups would sit and hit random keys. Sometimes teenagers would show off simple tunes. And sometimes, on lucky days, someone who knew what they were doing would sit down and play something beautiful. Whenever that happened, the boy's heart felt as if it had sprouted wings. He listened to every note like it was the most precious thing in the world. He didn't know the names of the keys, the chords, or the melodies, but he memorized the sounds. His mind recorded them, played them back, shaped them into new songs only he could hear. Sometimes, he would close his eyes right there in front of the shop, imagining his fingers floating across the keys. In his mind, he wasn't a poor child in worn-out clothes. In his mind, he was a musician, sitting proudly behind a shining piano in front of an audience that clapped for him. He never told anyone about these dreams. People rarely talked to him unless they were dropping a coin or asking him to move aside. But that was okay. The boy had learned long ago that some dreams grow best in silence. One afternoon, the sky suddenly darkened with heavy clouds, and rain started pouring down without warning. The boy ran to the only shelter nearby the entrance of the music store. He stood close to the wall, trying not to drip water inside. He didn't want to get scolded. Rainwater slid down his hair and soaked his clothes, making him shiver. But as he stood there, he realized he could hear the sound of a piano from inside the shop more clearly than ever before. The notes were so soft and calming that he forgot he was cold. His eyes drifted toward the open door, where he could see a man trying out a piano. The shop owner didn't seem too pleased with the boy standing near the door. But he didn't say anything, at least not at first, when the man testing the piano left. The owner turned to the boy and said, "Don't block the entrance." The boy nodded immediately and stepped farther away, but he didn't leave. He stayed at the edge of the door, just close enough to hear everything. After a while, when the rain stopped and the sun returned, the boy wandered back to his usual spot near the window. He placed his hands on the glass gently, almost like he was touching the piano inside. As the day went on, he noticed a small crowd forming near the store. People were whispering and pointing. A well-known pianist had come to the market. He wasn't the kind of celebrity who needed cameras following him, but people recognized him from his performances and online videos. He had come to test a special grand piano the store had recently received. The boy pressed closer to the window, his heart beating fast. He had never heard a real, famous pianist play live. Everyone inside the store watched in silence as the pianist sat down, adjusted the bench, and placed his fingers on the keys. Then the music began. It wasn't rushed or showy. It was calm, deep, and full of emotion. Each note felt like a story. The boy's eyes widened as he listened. The melody washed over his mind like waves in the ocean. He felt something inside him open up, something that had been quietly growing for years. The pianist finished after a few minutes, and the crowd clapped. The boy didn't clap. He couldn't. He was too overwhelmed. His fingers twitched as if wanting to play along. After thanking the audience, the pianist glanced outside and noticed the boy standing alone by the window. Most people were leaving, but the child stayed frozen, eyes shining like he had seen magic. The pianist walked to the door and opened it slightly. "You like music?" he asked gently. The boy nodded slowly. "Do you play?" the pianist asked. The boy shook his head. He had never touched a piano in his life. The pianist studied him for a moment. There was something in the boy's expression, something pure, honest, and full of longing. "Come inside," the pianist said softly. The boy's heart jumped. He hesitated, unsure if it was really allowed. The store owner looked surprised but didn't object. Mainly because it was the famous visitor making the request. The boy stepped inside carefully, afraid his wet shoes might dirty the floor. He walked slowly toward the piano, every step feeling like a dream. When he reached the bench, he looked at the pianist with quiet fear. "It's okay," the pianist said. "Try it. Just press a few keys." The boy sat down gently. His feet barely reached the floor. His fingers hovered above the keys, trembling slightly. He was scared to make a mistake, scared to break something. Scared this moment would disappear. He pressed one key. A soft sound rang out. His heart fluttered. He pressed another, then another. Then, almost without realizing, his hands began to move slowly at first, then faster. He didn't know the proper technique. He didn't know scales or chords. But he played a melody he had carried inside him for years. A melody built from every tune he had ever heard through the glass window. A melody shaped by hope, loneliness, and dreams he could never speak out loud. The store grew silent. The owner froze. Customers paused mid-step. A woman shopping for a small keyboard turned around, eyes wide. Even the famous pianist stood there, shocked. The boy's hands moved with surprising confidence, flowing from one note to another. It wasn't perfect, but it was beautiful, raw, emotional, and full of life. He played like someone who had lived the song, not learned it. When he reached the final note, his fingers stopped. The room went still. Then the applause came. It wasn't forced or polite. It was real, loud, full of admiration. The boy looked around, confused, unsure if he had done something wrong. The pianist stepped forward, knelt beside him, and said with a warm smile, "You have a gift. A real one." The boy felt tears fill his eyes. No one had ever said those words to him before. What started as a rainy afternoon, simple shelter under a shop entrance, had turned into the moment that would change his entire life. The evening crowd kept growing near the corner cafe. The sound of the young boy's music had already spread across the street. People who normally passed by without looking at anyone now stood still, turning toward the piano as if something magnetic was pulling them. By this time, the boy had no idea how many people were watching him. His whole world was the piano in front of him. His eyes were half closed. His hands were moving with a confidence he didn't even know he had. And the music came out so smooth that it felt like it was flowing straight from his heart. The cafe manager stepped out again, shocked to find that even more customers were standing outside instead of sitting inside. A group of teenagers who were laughing loudly only minutes earlier were now whispering to each other, wondering how a street child could play like that. A woman who had been walking home with grocery bags stopped right in front of the piano, her mouth slightly open like she couldn't believe what she was hearing. The boy didn't know any of this. What he did know was the feeling inside him like someone had finally opened a locked door in his chest. All the music he had kept hidden was rushing out. When he reached the final notes of the song, his fingers slowed, his breathing steadied, and the last soft chord floated into the air, hanging there for a moment like it didn't want to disappear. Then the crowd burst into applause. The sound was so loud and sudden that the boy jumped a little. He wasn't used to people clapping for him. In fact, he wasn't used to people even noticing him. The noise made his chest tighten with a strange mix of fear and excitement. He slowly looked up and saw dozens of faces turn toward him, smiling, cheering, nodding with approval. A small child sitting on his father's shoulders waved at him. An older man near the cafe door gave him a thumbs up. A woman near the front wiped her eyes as if the music had pulled memories out of her. For a moment, the boy became shy, lowering his face. But the applause only grew louder. Someone shouted, "Play another one." Someone else added, "Please don't stop." The boy didn't know many songs, but somehow, without thinking too hard, he placed his fingers back on the keys. The piano wasn't in perfect condition, and some of the keys were slightly stiff, but the boy didn't care. He started playing something he used to hum quietly while sitting on the sidewalk, a tune he had created just to comfort himself during long nights. It wasn't a proper piece of music, but it had emotion, something raw, something honest. The crowd slowly quieted again. Their attention locked on him. A man in a neat suit who had been on a phone call earlier now stood completely still, his phone lowered to his side. He kept glancing between the boy and the piano, trying to make sense of what he was witnessing. A restaurant server nearby whispered, "Is he trained?" Someone shrugged. Another said, "Maybe he learned by watching videos." But even they knew deep down that this wasn't just practice. This was something natural, something rare, as the boy continued playing his own tune. The evening breeze carried the sound down the street. People who were far away began walking toward the music, curious about what was happening. A cyclist stopped, stepped off his bike, and stood among the crowd. Even a street vendor selling snacks walked closer, still holding his tray but completely distracted by the melody. When the song ended, the crowd erupted into applause again, this time even louder. Some clapped above their heads, others whistled in appreciation. The boy gently moved his hands away from the keys. As if afraid the applause wasn't really for him, he stood up slowly, unsure of what to do. A few children ran toward him and asked, "How did you play like that?" He smiled nervously but didn't answer. He wasn't used to talking much. The world had taught him to speak only when necessary. But now, people wanted to know more about him, and that made him anxious. A middle-aged woman stepped forward. She was wearing simple clothes and had a warm expression on her face. She asked kindly, "Do you have a place to stay? Where are your parents?" But the boy froze and gave no reply. He didn't want to talk about his life. He didn't want pity. He just wanted to disappear into the crowd. But he couldn't. He was the center of attention. The cafe manager, who had been observing everything, moved closer to him. He said gently, "You played beautifully. If you want, you can use this piano anytime." The boy's eyes widened in surprise. He wasn't used to people offering him anything, especially not something as valuable as a piano. He whispered a soft thank you, almost too quiet to hear. Just then, a tall man with gray hair pushed through the crowd. He had been listening from a distance and looked serious, but not in a harsh way, more like someone who had heard something that stirred old memories. He approached the boy slowly and said, "Who taught you to play like that?" The boy hesitated. He wasn't sure how to answer. After a moment, he whispered, "Nobody taught me." The man looked stunned. He crossed his arms and studied the boy with disbelief. "You mean, you learned all that on your own?" The boy nodded lightly. The gray-haired man stared at him for a long moment. Then he did something unexpected. He placed a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder and said, "You have a gift, a rare one." The boy didn't know what to say. He had never been called gifted before. Most people ignored him, or glanced at him with pity, or sometimes with annoyance, when he tried to find food or a safe place to sit. But now, for the first time, someone was speaking to him with respect. It felt unusual. It felt new. A few people in the crowd pulled out their phones and started recording the scene. They weren't recording to mock him. They were recording because they knew something special had just happened. Something worth remembering. The boy noticed the phones, but instead of feeling embarrassed, he felt proud for the first time in his life. The gray-haired man cleared his throat and said to the cafe manager, "This boy shouldn't be playing on the streets. Someone needs to help him." The manager nodded. "I agree. He deserves better." The boy looked around, confused. He had always taken care of himself. He didn't expect anyone else to step in. But the manager and the older man kept discussing him like they genuinely wanted to support him. Someone from the crowd offered to buy him dinner. Another said they could get him clean clothes. A woman even asked if he wanted to join a small music group she ran for local kids. The boy felt overwhelmed. For so long, nobody saw him. And now suddenly so many people wanted to help. But the gray-haired man spoke again, his voice calm but firm. He needs proper training. Maybe even a chance to perform somewhere safer. I can arrange something, the crowd murmured, impressed. The boy stood quietly, trying to understand what was happening. He wasn't used to kindness. He wasn't used to adults taking him seriously. Everything felt unreal, like a dream he didn't want to wake up from. The man leaned toward him and said softly, "Do you trust me?" The boy hesitated, then gave a tiny nod. He didn't know where this would lead him. He didn't know if he was making the right choice. But something inside him told him that life was about to change. Maybe the world wasn't as cold as he thought. Maybe there were people willing to lift him up. The man smiled and said, "Good, because tomorrow, I want you to play for someone important." The boy blinked. "Who?" he whispered. "You'll see," the man replied. The crowd exchanged curious glances, wondering what he meant. But the man didn't explain further. He simply placed a gentle hand on the boy's back and guided him toward the cafe, telling him he would make sure. The boy had a warm meal and a safe place for the night. The boy looked back once at the piano. The piano that had changed everything in just a few minutes. He didn't know what the next day would bring. But he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope, and that was only the beginning of the journey. That would leave the whole city talking.